Chuck Hagel. Perhaps a certain amount of prescience on your part, choosing Chuck Hagel, but clearly a part of, the overall decision to make this film. Why did you decide that this was your particular odyssey, and why those particular bookends at the beginning and end?
We went to a soothsayer in 2005 who said we have good feeling about Chuck Hagel. The origin, the impetus to make this film actually came from a very simple experience. I was living in Los Angeles at the time and obviously working in entertainment. And the community in Los Angeles, and particularly in entertainment in Los Angeles, if you are engaged in some type of political event or get-together, if there is a speech that's being given, or if there's a State of the Union, or around the times of elections, people will hold house parties for the debates or for the conventions. And the thing that I noticed that was undeniable was, in the time that I was out there, was that it was almost always people engaged in conversation that were nodding to one another over their, appropriately liberal a glass of white wine, and that there really wasn't any across the aisle socialization. And if somebody is Republican in Los Angeles, it's essentially the equivalent of career suicide. So they tend to keep that to themselves. They're quite closeted in that regard. And I found that was really startling to me, because I really didn't have a sense of the other. I felt that I would be able to engage in a dialogue with them, but they were not there to be found. And I think it was particularly the first film, Split and Divided America, was made in the aftermath of the 2004 election. And because I think that the decisions that we're making now when it comes to domestic policy, but domestic policy so often bleeds over into international policy. I'm actually half Dutch, half American. My father's Dutch, and I was born and raised in Holland, and then actually went to high school here in Washington, D.C., and have been back and forth. That there's such, for me, it was so evident that there is such an, I don't think you can overstate the size of the role that America plays on the geopolitical stage globally, that when we are making decisions that impact, obviously, future generations of Americans, but also future generations of global citizens, that when half of that country, and now we see in these elections, even with the mandate that Bush 43 claimed after 2004, we're still only talking about a 3.5% difference. The same thing with Obama having won over Romney with the percentage that he did. We still are always talking about these tiny little fractions between who's the winner and who's the loser, and that means that half the country doesn't believe what the other half of the country is supporting, and vice versa. And for the decisions that we're making, I was astounded that this phenomenon of the other not being seen as, I think it's Chris Nelson in the film who says, not just as politically misguided, but fundamentally wrong. And I wanted to go out and explore not which party had gotten it more wrong than the other, but this phenomenon of this otherness of the other party. And then for that, we came up with, and I think that was what helped us both in being able to bring the people to the conversation that we hope to, including Peter here, was that the structure for the films has always been everyone gets the same 6 questions, and that kind of levels the playing field on an organic basis that I think people responded to, and you then are able to bring people into the fold and into the conversation who are incredibly valuable in that regard. In terms of being able to sit down with Chuck Hagel and Senator Evan Bayh, those were two who were really interesting to us. Evan Bayh wrote a well-publicized piece, a well-recognized piece in the New York Times, simply titled "Why I'm Leaving the Senate." And obviously, his father was a senator, and he, in that article, and what so struck me about that article, in that article he wrote about remembering what it was like, and not to be overly nostalgic about previous eras, but being able to recognize that, yes, there have been changes and things have shifted, and that when he was growing up, people would come over and have Thanksgiving dinner, or would spend time together, that kind of off-hour time, which is when so many things do take place, when so many meaningful conversations that seem to be earthed in a more social soil end up being incredibly productive. And that had shifted, and then he lamented that shift. And then obviously Senator Hagel has been known for being, so to speak, undisciplined, not following the orders and the directives of what one as a party member should do. So I think that those two figures specifically kind of embody this idea of not necessarily being party first, but hopefully being country first. And that they were some of the last interviews that we did for the film, and kind of brought the journey full circle of wanting to go out and find those voices and engage in that dialogue, not from a why are you doing this incorrectly, but how is it that we are in these relationships when it comes to political conversation at a time when we're facing such staggering challenges, whether they're environmental or whether they're in terms of infrastructure or healthcare, education, or as we see now, kind of this debt and fiscal crisis that seems to come back now with greater frequency and greater regularity and greater consequences. So it was very much from I wouldn't say necessarily simple curiosity, but it came from a very sincere curiosity about how is it that we've come to this place where, you know, all the liberals are Democrats and all the conservatives are Republicans, and there seems to be a widening gap between the two that is really going to compromise our ability to address these staggering challenges that we do ultimately face as a nation, and, you know, our children and our children's children and so on will be facing them, and that's really where it came from.
Well, just quickly, Peter, there seems to be a hearkening in this film back to the golden days right after the Second World War, and I'm sort of thinking back to the 19th century and the venality and vitriol of politics and political cartoons, and, you know, maybe it wasn't parties that swayed the masses, but certainly newspaper editors and owners were making massive decisions on how the country might think. Is this really, I mean, in the last 12 years, is this really something new? I mean, what is significantly different here?
Sure. Before I get to that, I do want to take a moment of personal privilege and say thank you all for showing up. Only in Washington, D.C. could you fill a room on a Friday night with a political documentary. I think
Only
I'm grateful.
on
I'm a little
Capitol Hill.
troubled. Capitol Hill, right. Where most of you are looking at that going, oh, I know that guy. Oh, yeah, he's my neighbor. Oh, yeah. As has been indicated, I'm an adjunct instructor at George Washington University and also Emerson College, and I have been on the other side. I've spent 20 years doing this stuff, 3 tours of the House, 1 of the Senate. On the outside, I've worked for everybody from American Farmland Trust and America's Funniest Home Videos to World Wildlife Fund and wickedcoolstuff.com. And on the inside, I have seen it up close and personal. I was in a district office for a Democrat in a Republican district during health care under Clinton. I was the chief of staff in the House under impeachment. And I went back to help with health care reform for a Democrat from Wisconsin this last time. And like my boss insisted on walking through the crowd that was shouting "Kill the bill" from the Longworth building over to the floor of the House. I've managed death threats for my boss, and I've received death threats. Mm-hmm. So I've seen this all very up close and personal. And your question, I think, is a terrific one. You know, we look back at those magical, happy times when America was unified and we all got along. Say the Civil Rights era. Oh wait, no, not that. maybe further back. Maybe World War II. If you weren't a Japanese American, that was a terrific time. Maybe even further back. You know, Jefferson was what a baboon. Lincoln was a rail splitter. We have always been very vicious in politics. Newspapers have historically been exceedingly partisan. You know, they were partisan organs for a long time. One thing that is pointed out in the film that I do think is different is post-World War II, up until sort of the explosion of cable television, we all watched the same things. So we all were having one national conversation. We're all talking about the same things in the same terms. And that led to a unifying presence, and that was terrific. If you were white, male, had power, and worked at these networks, if you're African American, if you were poor, if you were Hispanic, if you were not part of that conversation, if you disagreed with the conversation politically, it wasn't a terrific time, right? And as these guys point out in their interviews in the film, one of the things that these new outlets give rise to is people can finally hear their voice on television, on the web, on radio, whatever, and that can be good, right? You can say, yeah, you know what, I'm right. There are people who agree with me. The disadvantage, of course, is we then chase our own little rabbit hole. We spend our entire lives going, see, I told you so. So it has been worse. The Civil War was arguably far worse, for example. It has been better, but statistically it is worse now than it has been the past couple decades.
Why don't you talk a little bit specifically to that? I mean,
The Civil War? I'm sorry.
No, talking about sort of the change. I hadn't realized that a negative campaign ad actually translates into reducing the number of people that go to the polls.
Well, the data aren't clear. There are a lot of assertions. Any political scientists in the crowd tonight? Give it up. Political scientists? Woot, woot. No? Big data people? No? Okay. A lot of assertions made in the film, some made by me, it turns out. The data don't bear out. You know, it's well, one of the things that turns out doesn't matter actually fact checkers. The whether or not political ads drive down turnout is an open question. It also begs the question, what's a negative ad? You know, if I say I believe in God, ask my opponent what he thinks, am I attacking my opponent? If my opponent votes for something that I disagree with, or that you as a voter disagree with, is that a negative ad? If it's true, and it's a differentiator that matters to vote, I don't know. What becomes a negative ad? I don't know. I'm not sure that it drives down turnout. I think people get disgusted with politics because they want it to work, right? There's a terrific political scientist named John Hibbing at the University of Nebraska who wrote a book with Elizabeth Tice Morse called Stealth Democracy. And John's a good guy. He's liberal, thoughtful guy. He very badly wants the America that I'm guessing most of us want based on the guffaws in the audience at points in the film. And he's troubled by all the data he finds. What he finds mostly is that most of Americans mostly hate politics most of the time. And Robert Putnam's magical bowling leagues aren't substantiated by data. And Putnam has actually later admitted a lot of his research isn't supported by data. We bowl with people like us. We get along great as long as we're surrounded by people like us, right? And when there's a political problem, we want it fixed. Just go fix it. And we view politics, this is a bit of an in-your-face metaphor, but it's one that John approves of my defense, is most of us, most of the time, view politics like a toilet. We want it to work. And if our toilet's running, we don't call in several plumbers and have a consultation about low flow versus now the American standard. What kind of piping do I need? Fix it. Right? Our schools are broken. Fix them. Our deficit and debt are out of control. Fix them. The challenge, of course, is these are complicated issues that raise fundamental questions about federalism, about local control, about responsibility, about fairness, about justice, and you can't just fix it. But most voters, most of the time, hire politicians to do the job of running America, right? And that's just not how it goes oftentimes, which is why I then think people get turned off and turnout goes down. I'm not sure it's negative ads. I think it's a bit of a different story.
Okay, before we go to the audience, Jared, I want to pull you in quickly. You're the editor of this film.
Sure.
And Kelly went across the country and interviewed. How many interviews were there? 100? I mean, presumably more than we see here.
There were a lot. I mean, as you can see, we gave a lot of, we tried to give everybody a few moments in there, which is great because you get this cacophony of different people saying similar and sometimes different things. But at the same time, you don't allow a lot of certain individuals to go into greater depth. But it's a choice we wanted to make to show that we did go out and talk to a number of different individuals and people on the street, pundits, politicians, professors. We wanted to make sure that there was a nice mosaic in the film. I think that I'm from Columbus, Ohio. I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and I was back just right before the election in October and September, and whenever I had a wedding, I was there for Labor Day, and spent a lot of time with family. And this kind of film was always, while cutting this film, it was something that I always think about. I think about I do, and it's not just trying to be like, oh yeah, I'm from Ohio, and these, the classic swing voter, the classic kind of mix of Republicans and Democrats are sitting there, or the undecided, but it kind of is with my family. It's kind of strange. And I think this film, I thought a lot about the people that I spend those holidays with while we were cutting it, and just trying to create a platform so we could have a dialogue and have a discourse and be able to sit down and start talking about some of these issues. Because not everybody has the same facts and the same starting point. I think this film allows you to at least start from the same spot. And then the discourse and the conversation can go in a number of directions, and you can get deeper, and you can go and talk about all sorts of stuff. But at least this is a point, a vantage point that everyone can step back and take stock and get on the same page on. So,
Great.
yeah.
Okay, questions? Yes, in the back, red shirt.
Hi. This to kind of follow up on what you were saying. When you talked a lot about dialogue and how we dialogue with each other, and as I was sitting here watching it, a gentleman who was probably more to the right made a comment, and I would not need to call anyone out here, but someone around me said, "Idiot." And so I feel like, if we in this room who are interested,
That was me.
So the question is there hope, or how do we convene a civil conversation?
Yeah, so my question to you guys would be where do you see the openness in terms of our dialogue? And I guess maybe a follow-up to that, can you point to any examples of other governments that have such a diverse population with diverse opinions, diverse backgrounds that have really been able to come together over various issues and compromise?
I think I caught the same thing you did. There's laughter at certain points, and I was trying hard to listen. I've seen this. Actually, the first time I've seen this cut, but I've seen some of these interviews before. My first reaction to people with whom I disagree is, come on, idiot. But then you sort of check yourself. I do think there's hope, right? I believe deeply in this system. I came to Washington because I believe in this system. The inauguration for me is a remarkable testament. 4 years ago, even more so, in part because the historic moment of an African-American president, but in part because after a vicious campaign, millions of people gathered on the mall, the leaders of the country, and said, okay, here you go. And that was it. There are no guns, right? Nobody hunkered down. President Bush got in a helicopter and went away. I mean, that's an amazing thing. It's a testament to what Rousseau and then later Bell and others call civil religion. So I do believe in the hope. And there are some elements where this can work. Maybe, I don't know about other countries, but domestically, there are interesting projects like America Speaks. Are you familiar with America Speaks? They convene town hall meetings around the country on controversial subjects, and not like the shouting kind that these guys featured. They go into an area. They do this in D.C. with the budget process in D.C. They find people who demographically represent a region, right? And so the proportional number of African Americans and Anglos and Hispanics and young and old and women and men and all this, you put them at tables of about 10. You give them each what amounts to a little feeling thermometer voting device. And you have a handout that's constructed by people across a range of issues on whatever the topic of the day is. I helped them do one on the budget. So we had Taxpayers for Common Sense, Heritage Foundation, American Enterprise Institute, Brookings, everybody, writing this manual on the budget. And people sit together for 8 hours, and they hash out what's going to work, and they come to conclusions, and they vote, and it's a civil conversations. At a national level, it's very hard to implement, right? Because then Congress doesn't behave the same, doesn't respond to those political incentives. At a local level, however, it is seen to work very, very well, and change can happen if you have a thoughtful, meaningful conversation in which people at the beginning are primed to listen rather than primed to react. And there are other experiments going on as well. The Omidyar Network, founded by Pierre Omidyar of eBay Fortunes, is funding something to do this. I forget what his project is called. In the wake of Congresswoman Gifford's shooting, the University of Arizona launched something, the National Center for Civil Discourse, which is now headed by Carolyn Lukensmeyer, who used to head America Speaks. The board includes Presidents Clinton and Bush. So there are efforts and there are things. There is hope. There is hope.
I think that the the thing that I would complete on that thought is, and I think one of the most salient points of that is, what's the point of departure for engaging in the dialogue? And I think that when the point of departure for engaging in the dialogue is sincere in its desire for exchange of information and the willingness to be surprised by what someone says. And Jared and I did a call-in actually for Columbus when the film was doing its nationwide theatrical release, that we did a call-in from New York because we were going to Columbus for the screenings there, and there was this older gentleman who called in, And he ended up telling the story that I thought was pretty remarkable about how they had something called Coffee Thursdays, and basically they got together for 2 hours just to talk, and it was people from all political walks of life, and they would discuss things that they felt was important in their community. And I said, through which group is this being organized? This was, in the course of this hour-long radio interview that we did that obviously had a call-in portion to it. And they said, not really. It just kind of started because a few of us were sitting around and we ended up exchanging ideas in a way that we thought was actually really helpful to make sense of what it is that we're facing as a community and seeing that mirrored in the country at large. And it's that type of small kind of organic local spark that I think is very often one of the most surprising and welcome departures from what we see on a larger scale. And what's noteworthy from that experience for me was the fact that they simply wanted to get together to understand certain things better. And so I think that the point of departure was what dictated ultimately their outcome. And I think that kind of on a philosophical level, I think is what is the most important element in that, to create the possibility for surprise and also possibility for success in that type of engagement.
Yes, sir.
You come from the Netherlands. I'd like to ask what percentage of people vote there, and then in the States, I think the primary voting percentage is even lower than the national average, but we're low. How do you fix that?
In Holland, it's not mandated by law. Like in Australia, for example, you have to vote. You're fined if you don't vote, and so they have voter turnout that's upwards of 97, 98%, because people don't want to be fined. In Holland, it ranges between 75 and 85%. There's a different type of civic engagement there. It's also slightly difficult because it's 16 million people. Holland is also one of the most densely populated countries in the world. So there is there's an immediacy to your community that you don't get necessarily in the States quite the same way. One of the things that we've had the great fortune of doing is taking the film and touring with it around the world through the State Department. We screened it everywhere from Ankara to Amsterdam to Beijing to Berlin and all in between. And one of the things that I think is important as a cultural distinction, certainly in coming from Holland, is that Europeans are always so perplexed by this idea of religion, and more specifically this idea of religiosity, that there is this high degree of faith, or at least of statements of personal faith. And while I think that's true, Norm Ornstein points out in the film that we have higher, so to speak, testimonial rates when it comes to religious faith and outwards expression of that. The thing that I also think that it's true is that it's important to see the functionality of community expression within the context of that community. And if I think of, for example, the town where I grew up, you knew where you were in relation to the town square. And if you think of European towns, large or small, you do think of them in terms of squares, that you have squares in these towns where it is that people congregate. It's where the markets are. It's where often the largest church in the town is. It's where people generally go to interface with one another. And the thing that I noticed, and this film was the first time that I ever drove cross country, when you are in the middle of New Mexico, there's a vastness there that you can't explain to a European unless a European drives across it. It's just, there's nothing like it in Europe to say when you're leaving the Grand Canyon and you're driving towards Texas, there's an openness there that could swallow France. And that there's nothing, the driving 9 hours and not seeing anybody else isn't a myth. It really does happen, And so when you have societies, when you have communities there that are so spread out, it's important to recognize that organized faith then plays a different role. Of course, people want to have, and as Europeans do, as Americans do, as all people from all walks of life and all countries do, have expressions of their own personal faith to understand their mortality, to understand all these different things. But also, and we noticed this when we would go to mega churches, was that The food was amazing. And we were, an independent doc film crew, and we would show up on Sunday morning, and it was Starbucks coffee and brand names, Krispy Kreme donuts, and that type of thing. But you would watch people walk in, and I remember just being really struck by that, where we saw a family of 6 walk in. It was 2 parents and 4 kids. The parents knew exactly where they were going. There were different activities for the different ages of the 4 kids that they had with them, and all the kids knew where they were going. It had this complete social functionality that kind of the square does in the same way. Certainly in my experience, obviously, all this comes through a personal lens, as most opinions do, but that there was a way of that community coming together at a square that mega churches, I think, have been very thoughtful about that, and also explicit. I mean, megachurches are designed in the Midwest and in the Southwest to resemble malls, because that's where most people interact. And so they have the same architecture because they want to have very low barrier to entrance. They want people to feel comfortable coming in. And so these churches, I think, once I was explaining, I remember having this conversation in Germany and saying, you have to imagine that there isn't a town square on the eastern seaboard where you have older cities. You get more of a sense of square, but when you go into these newer cities, it just isn't there. That infrastructure isn't there. That hasn't been laid in the same way. And so you get these places that serve these roles. And once you kind of make the cultural bridge between the two experiences, it demystifies it. It demystifies it in a way, and I think that is valuable. So I think that there are certain things that you can correlate between cultures, but I think it's always important to frame it in the function that it serves to the community as a whole.
Yes.
It's an excellent documentary. I thought it was really evocative, provocative in some ways. But like throughout the whole thing, there was a lot of cacophony of opinions, like you were saying, and it almost leaves me feeling unsatisfied, because you have like one person saying complete opposite thing as another, and I'm not even speaking on partisanship, but on the causes of the split in partisanship. And I noticed that you didn't really spend any time like evaluating these. And as a political scientist and a big data guy, I would.
You didn't confess earlier.
I have data with me.
I'm just wondering, like he said, Putnam's argument didn't really hold up. And I think, I don't remember the author's name, like What's the Matter with Kansas?
Thomas Frank.
Other political scientists have looked at that and sort of questioned it. And I'm just wondering, was it a conscious decision to just evaluate the argument as an opinion matter, and that dissatisfaction, was that conscious?
You bring up a number of different interesting points, and I'll stick with that you thought that the documentary was excellent. You open yourself to you kind of open your flank to criticism when you tackle something as large as partisanship in America in this day and age, and its historical roots. This is not a documentary about elementary schools that cater to first generation Cuban immigrants in South Side of Miami. We went really, really broad, and what we hope, and that is, that's a significant hope. What we hope is that the documentary leaves people not necessarily unsatisfied, but wanting to find those answers. One of the things that we struggled most greatly with was the conclusion to the film. The remedy. What's the answer? And we purposefully kind of stepped away from it, because what I, as a documentary watcher, find to be the most frustrating is when someone says, and these are the 3 things you can do. Replace your light bulbs, vote, and don't go to Starbucks anymore. That I find, so for us, we hope that the debate that we platform leads people to take a step closer to the subject, and therefore find a channel and a path in that very much, as Peter says, there are a whole host of groups. We obviously didn't invent the fact that America has a partisan problem. There are huge people who are involved with this, and so it's our hope that this film, because it platforms it in this very broad way, allows people to take a step closer and then find, okay, what's their handle in, to be able to explore this in a more profound sense, to find the answers that aren't necessarily the easiest ones or the most comfortable ones. I mean, the documentaries that we have made and that we are making do deal with this ultimate decision point that you arrive at, which is, okay, so how am I going to change my behavior? And that's an uncomfortable place. Do I buy a different car? Do I take public transportation? Do I choose to change my diet? What are my lifestyle? Am I going to stop flying as much? You ultimately have to bring about the change that you want. You also ultimately have to make some uncomfortable choices, and there are pathways for that. And so that's kind of where the documentary strives. Because the other thing that I think is difficult with documentaries of this nature is that you often can fall into the turn towards despair, which
Let
is...
me pause you right there and ask Jared to weigh
Yeah.
in. You were the person who, at the end of the day, had all of this in front of you, had to bring it to a conclusion. I think that's a very good question.
Kelly and I were together. I mean, he wouldn't leave me alone, and I wouldn't leave him
But
alone.
weigh in quickly, and then I want Peter to comment just briefly on it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it was, we struggled a lot. I mean, you'd spend months working on something, and then you'd trash it, and you'd start over, trying to find the best way to put this stuff in a digestible, satisfactory packaging. And I think that, we tried to get opinions as well, but being filmmakers living in Brooklyn, New York, we're surrounded by a lot of like-minded people, so it was hard to find different views as well. I think, as Kelly talked about at the beginning of the Q&A, so we're in a position again where we're surrounded by people that do agree with us. But we, I think that after a while you just kind of make your peace with it, and you end up in a spot where you think that it's going to spark this kind of conversation that we're having, and that's where we left it. I think we kind of came up with the best possible solution that we thought we could do.
I think you're right. I think you're right. What I think this film does, does two terrific things, though, to lead to your question. One is, it makes the point very clearly that those with whom we disagree aren't evil, crazy, or lying. They're just as committed, just as righteous, and just as patriotic as everybody else. And that's a hard starting point for a lot of people, right? We all assume we're reasonable, smart, good human beings. And if you disagree with us, well, I'll explain my position. And if you disagree with me, I'll say it louder and slower. And if you still disagree with me, you're either stupid or mean or something, because I'm reasonable, and if you don't agree, you're therefore unreasonable. This film makes it very clear that is a profoundly foolish place to begin a conversation. The second thing it does that I think is interesting is point out that this is the political class, the professional, those of us who get accused of breaking the system, share the concerns as well, right? I mean, you hear from Tucker Carlson, you hear from Reverend Jackson, you hear from others saying this is a problem. And it's not that we insiders are making tons of money off the sheep of the American people by wrecking democracy so we can wear loafers, right? We came here to change the world. I did an interesting project for a client, which has to remain nameless, but I interviewed Democratic and Republican political professionals, ranging from people who did local mail, direct mail, to political consultants whose clients include Michelle Bachmann. And I said, did you break democracy? And if so, how do we fix it? And all of them were very concerned. They said, this is ridiculous. We cannot continue to function as a country this way. Consultants do this because, as Ezra Klein pointed out, I thought one of the best lines in the film was, it comes down to political incentives, right? But recognizing that the political class wishes it weren't as mean and wishes it were more fair and better, I think is a tremendously important contribution. And from there, we can have the conversation that Ezra Klein alludes to, which is about incentives. How do you change the incentive structure?
There's another question. Donna.
Yeah, I was interested in the part of the movie narrative and doing some of the history and talk about, the slavery became the powder keg for the Civil War, which was an ultimate backing out of dysfunction.
I don't think we're not coming to armed conflict. I don't think. I think that this will be the third conversation in 2 days I've had about the gun issue, 2 on television, 1 here, and my answer remains largely the same, which is everybody looked at Newtown and said, "I told you so." About half of America, a lot of America looked at it and said, "See, too many guns. We need real serious gun control. We need background checks. We need to close the gun shoe loophole, all that." And a number of others looked at it and said, "See, I told you so. We need to arm teachers." Right? Nobody looked at it. Very few people looked at it and said, "Holy cow, I need to rethink my position." And when they did, they probably regressed to the mean pretty quickly. One of the things that an interesting argument against an argument I make in the film about redistricting is that we are increasingly living in places where people agree with us, and so we're sorting as a country. Part of it is moving from the former industrialized Northeast to the new jobs in the South and Southwest, more conservative, more rural, however that may be. But ultimately, I don't know, maybe maybe it's naive, but I think we're going to yell and scream and nothing's going to happen, but I don't think anyone's going to take to the streets, I don't think.
I think, I agree with Peter on that. And I think that the illustration for me was that we went to interview Joe Zillmer, who wore the big 10-gallon cowboy hat in the film. And when we went there because he had a website that from the Great Plains Midwestern Church that had the tab on the website of election, and it had a picture of the Twin Towers in flames, and a text along the lines of don't vote on fiscal policy, don't vote on taxation, immigration, vote on righteousness, and the Lord will take care of the rest. The Lord punishes those who stray from the path. And so we arrived, and this was outside of Amarillo, Texas, which was literally the middle of nowhere. It was 8:30 on a Tuesday night. It was incredibly foggy, and we were kind of lost, and we finally found it. But it felt like the horror movie that we weren't making. And we arrived there, and it's a double-wide trailer. And he's literally, in Texan fashion, he's got a posse. And we walk in, and I would always walk in first, basically, to kind of introduce myself and to start to kind of get to know one another, because you want to have a pretty intensely sincere conversation about politics in an incredibly partisan time, which is a really, really difficult thing to do. And then you can just add the complicating factor that there's a camera, which changes everyone on the planet, regardless of who they are. Whether they've been in front of the camera for 7 years or not, you just change. And so I walk in, and he's sitting there, and he's about as far turned away in his chair as possible, that he's essentially like this. And he's huge on top of it. And it's a double wide, and I just feel really Californian, and I'm not even from California. And so I walk in, and I kind of get the temperature, and I just turn around, and I go back outside, and we've got Tarina, who's our director of photography, and then we've got Jeff, who was one of the producers on the film. And I turned to Jeff, and I was like, "Hey man, I'm already the bad cop. So if you need to play good cop, I think this could be a really valuable interview. If you need to play good cop to my already bad cop, but I haven't done anything, but in any event, they saw us coming. We're driving a minivan. We're slightly unwashed, and we've got California tags. We fulfill every single stereotype for them of what an indie doc film crew is that is out there to show these dumb Texan hicks why they're such morons for voting Republican. That's everything that he's getting from me. So go in, sit down. Tarina sets up the camera. It starts rolling, and he says, "So y'all a bunch of crazy liberals from California then?" And I'm just like, "Oh, God." I didn't say. And then Jeff chimes in because he's already been primed, and he says, "No. This is a nonpartisan documentary." He goes, I'm sure it is. Well, y'all give me your home addresses, and if you edit this wrong, I'll come visit you." And it's like, okay. And then he turns to his assistant pastor, and he says, "Sonny, can you go get my pistol out of my truck?" And at that point, it's like, yeah, that's not. I guess it's still funny, or at least I have to laugh because I am outside of nowhere, Amarillo, Texas, with plates that probably come off that van pretty easily. And so it started that way. It started with this real kind of, there was a very clear shot across the bow. And it took, I think, about 25 minutes of just dialoguing. And finally, he turned, and then literally turned, and physically, and the arms kind of loosened up. And we ended up having this great discussion. And I had a conversation with my mom about it afterwards. She said, "How are you not arguing with these people?" Because she knows that I have strong political opinions. I said, "Totally not my role. But some see this, in the era of Michael Moore and all the rest, some see this as the documentary filmmakers out there kind of as a hitman, going to punk people and get them to, to show them up on camera. And the thing that was amazing to me was his misgivings about me were about as profound as they could have been. Slowly over the course of our conversation, which was about an hour, it turned to the point at the end that when we were leaving, he said, next time you pass through Amarillo, which admittedly doesn't happen with an incredible amount of frequency, but he said, next time you pass through, really come look us up. And if you need a place to stay, always welcome. And that to me was such a remarkable moment of, yes, and it gets fueled, by O'Reilly on one side, or Oberman, if he can find a cable station that'll hire him, on the other side. And it does get fanned very often, but ultimately still, when you sit down, when a Kelly Nyks sits across from a Joe Zillmer and have that exchange, which is just, okay, tell me what it is, then that conversation can still be had. And that leads me to believe, as Peter said, that I don't think that we're a step away from ardent conflict. I think we're a step away from really serious discussions, but I don't think that we're there. I think that there still is that ultimate, okay, there is still a mutual concern for what we collectively share that leads these types of conversations that fly in the face of we're a step away from doomsday. And I think that was, for me, one of the most heartening things of the entire experience.
Nice. I think we have time for one more question, if anyone has a burning issue in the back.
You talked a little bit about the responsibility of the media. So can you address that a little bit more? I mean, like, are we ever going to be able to get away from the Fox networks and all that kind of thing?
Yeah,
What's going to happen? I mean, how do we control that? How do we control the economics of it all?
Sure. I think that there are a number of things that Jared and I are working on that deal with these ideas in different documentaries, but I think that what immediately comes to mind is when you talk about this is David Hume's writings that deal with the powers always in the hands of the governed, and I think that there's the clearest example of immediate democracy is purchasing of product, and I think that you see that in media directly. If shows get canceled all the time, TV networks spend an incredible amount of money on pilots, and they try to push a sitcom, and after 4 episodes, it's gone.
I don't talk about shows. What happens to the news? I mean, that's the problem.
Yeah,
Why is it censored?
I think that we have developed, and as Peter rightly points out, we now have these cocoons that are echo chambers. But I think that we are still looking at it. I mean, it's the fascinating thing now is if you go on Google and you have a certain type of search history because you have certain political worldviews, and your neighbor does who has a different worldview, you end up with different results, and different results that are consistently confirming against, again, your feedback loop. I think it does ultimately come down to the point of departure of how is it that you're choosing to engage with information? Are you choosing to engage with information that is going to give you a view of the world as it is, or are you choosing to engage with information that is going to give you the view of the world as you want to see it? And I think that if we open those conversations to data gathering rather than data selection, I think that starts to approach that. But unfortunately, there is not a silver bullet in that capacity. It does deal with a shifting of paradigms and a shifting of the way we relate to information and the way we relate to one another.
I think for me, I hear your concern, and I'm not sure there is a good answer, right? Because if you were to say, well, you know what, the fairness doctrine has to come back. Well, even if it did, it wouldn't matter because that only applies to broadcast because of radioactive. Like, there's no, with the First Amendment, there's really no good reason or tool or mechanism by which the government can say this counts as news, this doesn't, this is fair and balanced, this isn't. And I'm not sure I'd want the president deciding what's fair and balanced. Right? With this president, all about it. You pick. I voted for you. Last president, I might take issue with it. The second is, what if I'm wrong? As somebody pointed out in the film, these are for-profit companies. They have a fiduciary legal responsibility to return investors' money. If people didn't want to watch it, they wouldn't. No one is forcing anyone to watch Fox. So then what do we do about it? What do we do about it? I think to Kelly's point, one of the things that I think about this a lot, and one of the things that strikes me is, once again, I think a failure of the education system. One of the things we don't know how to do in this country, we don't teach each other or think about how to do, is argue. Right? For the founders, part of the founders' educational canon was classical rhetorical theory. They all read Aristotle's rhetoric. They read Quintilian. They read Cicero. They learned how to construct and defend an argument. They learned how to reason. We don't reason. We don't think about reasoning. We jump to a conclusion. We go to Fox and go, I told you the conclusion was there, and these are the bits. These are the data selections. You don't watch Fox or MSNBC or CNN or go on whatever website or whatever you go on and think, well, that's not a very good argument. I haven't thought about that. You look at it and go, aha, I knew it. Or, I knew it. Right? And part of the problem we have in political conversations is we don't know what a good political argument is. Well, that's just my opinion. My lovely young wife and I had an unfortunate conversation this morning with a guy. Not with each other. No, with a third party who said, well, I'm sorry you disagree with my view, or you don't see that. Like, no, you're wrong. You're fundamentally racist. No. Because, well, that's just the way I feel. It's not an argument. But unfortunately, we don't teach how to argue. Political discussion is discouraged in schools. Right? Debate teams are going away. Model UNs are going away. We're not taught how to, and if we're taught how to think and reason, and we have higher expectations what an argument is, then maybe we won't watch Fox, or maybe we'll demand better programming, and the market will then decide what shows get canceled and which ones don't. But ultimately, the wonder of our system, part of the wonder of our system is our First Amendment and our Constitution. That also constrains what we can do to constrain our system.
Okay, before we close, I have to say at Hill Center, we love basking in the reflected glory of other folks. And I just have to share that this film team is on their way to Sundance. They have a short film that was selected as part of the Focus Forward project. And they are up in the pantheon of current, documentary, gurus, Morgan Spurlock and Alex Gibney, and, folks that we love to see out there really pushing the envelope, making us think. I think Peter sort of jumped on that. It's a pity we don't all study Kikero and learn how to.
There will be a quiz, too. There will be a quiz. Number 2 pencils on the tables in the back.
But anyway, please join me in thanking the fantastically dynamic Peter Loge, Jared Scott, and of course, Kelly Nyks. Thank you very much.